In this section, we'll talk about flexibility as well as rehabilitation and taking care of your lower back to prevent injury. We've previously defined flexibility as the range of motion about a joint and discussed the fact that for most folks, this is the physical fitness component that gets overlooked the most frequently. It is affected by your age. We typically lose mobility and flexibility as we age. And in general, all things being equal, females are more flexible than males. And we know that there's a relationship between your range of motion or ability to move freely and injuries. There's also a genetic component to how much flexibility we have. And also, the types of activities that we do day to day impact our flexibility, mobility, because if we spend an extended amount of time in a certain position, then that will ultimately change the range of motion about a joint and potentially our risk for injury. And then just keep in mind that range of motion from one joint to another can vary dramatically. And as we see sometimes, folks are more flexible in the upper body versus lower body, or even maybe a difference in side to side of the body. Next, let's talk about types of stretching. And the first is a ballistic stretch, sometimes called a bouncing stretch. And this is where we use the body's momentum to provide or to create the stretch. So if I am not very flexible, for example, and I want to reach down and touch my toes, and the only way I can do that is by placing my arms overhead and really forcing the hands to come down towards the toes. That is a bouncing sort of stretch because I'm using the body's momentum to try to force me into a range of motion that I can't usually get into. And this can cause injury, and it actually tightens up the muscles rather than stretching the muscles, which is our goal. And so this type of stretching, there are some times when it's appropriate in athletics, but for what we do, our activities, ballistic stretching would not be appropriate. So let's talk about other types of stretching that we certainly want to include in our workouts. And the next one is dynamic stretching. And this is the equivalent of our warm-up routine, in that we're gradually increasing our range of motion, doing about 8 to 10 reps of an activity or of an exercise, if you will, in a light way to increase the blood flow to the muscle and also to bring up the core temperature, increase blood flow, and get the muscles ready for physical exercise. And it's important to remember that even if you're going out to run or ride your bike or whatever, just going at an easy walk or a jog as your warm-up is really not the best way to warm up. Your dynamic warm-up should allow you to move in all different planes or directions. So I should do some forward and back movements, and then side to side, and then even some motions that allow me to rotate and move side to side as well. And this warms up all the muscles that are used during an activity. The next type of stretching is static stretching, and as the name implies, it's really a slow stretch that's held for 10 seconds or longer. There are two types of static stretching, and you need to know the difference. The active type of static stretching is where we use the opposing muscle group to the one that we want to stretch to actually create the stretch. So what I'm going to have you do here is set your feet flat on the floor, and in this position, I want you to keep your heels on the ground and pull your toe up towards the ceiling, up towards your the ceiling, and then hold that position. So although you feel the muscle in the front outside of your shin contracting, you're getting a stretch in the calf muscle in the back of the leg. And we would hold that 10 seconds. And so that's considered active because I actually have an active contraction in that opposing muscle group in the front of the shin to create the stretch in the calf. And then another type of static stretching is passive. And in this one, as the name implies, I'm just using some type of assistance in order to hold me in a position that I need to enable the stretch. And I could use a chair, I might use a stretch strap or a towel. There are any number of assistance devices that I could use. So, for example, if you stand next to your chair and take your heel and prop it up on the chair with your legs straight and then get nice and tall and then hinge from the hips, and you'll feel a stretch in your hamstring. Now, if you can't keep your legs straight on the chair, then go ahead and find something lower. It doesn't have to be the height of a chair. It could be a couple of steps. If you're standing on the ground and you're next to a couple of stairs, place your heel on the second or third step. Get nice and tall, and then hinge from the hips so the back isn't rounded. And then you're using essentially the chair or the step for your assistance to get the stretch. So try this one as well. You should feel it in the back of the thigh. The last type of stretching we'll talk about is what we call PNF, or proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. For our purposes, we'll just call it PNF. And sometimes this is called contract, relax, stretching. What you do is you essentially get in a position where you're stretching the muscle that you want to target. And then in this position, you contract that muscle for about 3 to 6 seconds, and then release the contraction, stay in that position, and then hold the stretch another 10 to 30 seconds. And then you can repeat that 2 or 3 times. Typically, what happens after you've held the contraction 3 to 6 seconds and you relax it, then you can, for example, with the hamstring stretch, you can hinge forward a little bit further. And for folks who are really tight, sometimes this type of stretching works really well because it actually triggers a reflex that causes a muscle to relax. And the hamstring stretch, seated on the floor with one leg in front, if you look at that link, you'll see that that is an example of a PNF stretch for the hamstrings. So next, let's talk about when to do static stretching, because there's obviously a lot of new information about static stretching and how it's not recommended before a workout. And we've already discussed how we definitely want to do a dynamic warm-up with our dynamic stretching before we do an activity like weight training or some kind of cardiovascular training. But is it ever okay to do any static stretching before your workout? And the answer to that is yes. If you have already done your dynamic warm up and you have an area that is still really tight, like a muscle group, or an area that you have a problem with in terms of injury, it's okay to do a nice short stretch. I wouldn't hold it more than about 10 seconds if it's before your workout. And you can certainly do your static stretching because it's indicated at the end of your after your resistance training or aerobic exercise, and even after a shower is a great time to do some static stretching. So the main thing is we don't do static stretching before a warm up unless it's just for some targeted type muscle groups after we've already done the dynamic warm-up. And any done before the workout we keep to a nice short amount of time, 10 seconds or less. And then we can hold them 30 to 60 seconds all the way up to a minute if we wanted to post exercise. Now let's apply our FITT principle to flexibility. So how often should we stretch? Well, the minimum is 2 to 3 days a week. And ideally, we should do it every day, and we should stretch all the major muscle groups each day after our exercise, whether that is weight training or cardio. As far as intensity, that refers to what is the tightness level of the stretch. And it should feel like a slight tightness or discomfort, but it should not hurt. If it hurts, then you have too much tension on the muscle and you need to relax the stretch a little bit. The first T, as we said, is for time. And now this is talking about the total time of the workout here, meaning it shouldn't take you more than 10 minutes to do your flexibility. And for some folks, 5 minutes is certainly adequate. As far as holding the static stretch after a workout, we said that ideally that would be 10 to 30 seconds. You could certainly go longer than that if you wanted to, but the recommendation is 10 to 30 seconds. And we talked about the protocol for the P&F type of stretching, where you actually contract the muscle group in your stretch position that you want to work on, and then relax it, and then move into your stretch a little more, and then hold that 10 to 30 seconds, and then repeat as many times as you need to get the flexibility you want. And so each stretch that you do, regardless of whether it's a static or a P&F stretch, can be repeated 2 to 4 times. And our goal ultimately would be to get 60 seconds total of stretching for each muscle group if we added each of those times that we stretch that muscle group together. So that would be ideal, but just remember that some stretching is better than none. And so just don't skip the stretching. If you don't have much time, then focus on the muscle groups that are tightest for you. The last T refers to type of exercise. And obviously we want to stretch all the major muscle groups, but here we're really referring to, do I choose static stretching, dynamic stretching, or P&F stretching?